think this ought to resonate deeply with anyone who recognizes the setup of oppression that we've been brainwashed into accepting here in our Western society. In our oh so self-proud, self-congratulatory, we're number one, America, Trumptopia society. Or whatever country you live in, if you're listening internationally, I'm sure that this in some way translates. You may have to adjust the names of the players and the directions of the parties, which way they're coming from at you. But we've all have been played. We've all been pit against each other in our own countries by these opposition parties that hijack ideological constructs that once served a greater good, but are now used to keep you distracted enough, disconnected enough from your true divine nature that you will tolerate endless profiteering, endless pollution, endless injustice, endless criminal abuse, endless corruption, endless war profiteering. As long as you get your Xbox and your M&Ms and your Cheetos and your MTV and your Oscar Awards ceremonies, no offense, actor theater friends, I love this stuff too. Here's the thing. We can heal everything and everyone without tearing all those systems down. And we can have the Oscars and we can have movies and we can have snacky things and, fun, exciting stuff without the oppression and the abuse. But we won't get there by repeating history and guillotining people and then ascending other people up into those exact same positions of power. No matter how much we change the labels, if you put them in power, corrupt they will become. Forgive my interjection. I return to words exclusively in the book written by Alan Watts. I'm adding my own interpretive commentary as we go along. The West has no recognized institution corresponding to Taoism because our Hebrew Christian spiritual tradition identifies the absolute, that which we call God, with the moral and logical order of convention. That's the big scam. Let me read that again. The West has no organized institution corresponding to Taoism. Now, what does Taoism do in the context is just explained. It liberates you from convention. It frees you from the workaday grind so you can return to nature. It liberates you from the ideology so you don't become addicted to it and you can be a kind, humble, loving, giving person. Right, so returning to Alan Watts. Because our Hebrew Christian, and we can add Muslim or Islamic right to that, the trifecta, the way Karen Armstrong does in her book, The History of God. By the way, for those of you who don't realize, that's another book on my list here for this show, and her full title is A History of God, the 4,000-year quest of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Okay, so this is a trifecta. They've bound us in a trifecta of, and Watts, I'm sure, did not mean to neglect that. He just, whatever. I guess he's speaking specifically of sort of, in the 50s, Islam had not quite, when he wrote this, in the 50s, the migration of Muslims or the Islamic culture had not quite reached the extent that it has now. Now, that wasn't a criticism, okay? I'm not down with those anti-Muslim activists who say that the Muslims are trying to take over the world. You can't pick a fight with just one of the big three. You can't pick a fight with any religion because all religions have been hijacked. If it's an organized religion, it's been hijacked. If it's a spiritual movement of personal engagement with the divine, then we can talk about a whole nother story, right? I digress. The West has no recognized institution corresponding to Taoism because our Hebrew Christian spiritual tradition identifies the absolute, and in brackets, God, or as I like to say, that which we call God, with the moral and logical order of convention. This might almost be called a major cultural catastrophe because it weights the social order with the excessive authority, inviting just those revolutions against religion and tradition which have been so characteristic of Western history. By unnecessarily associating our everyday social order with the absolute, with a derivative ideological construct of the divine, and not allowing ourselves to have a true liberation experience, an immersive communion experience with reality and the true divinity as it actually is, we have traumatized ourselves and each other and everyone in the species. Again, that was my own thoughts interjecting. Because it weighs the social order with the excessive authority, inviting just those revolutions against religion and tradition, and, dare I add, to his words, tyranny, which have been so characteristic of Western history. It is one thing to feel oneself in conflict with socially sanctioned conventions, but quite another to feel at odds with the very root and ground of life, with the absolute self. The latter feeling nurtures a sense of guilt so preposterous that it must issue either in denying one's own nature or in rejecting God. That sentence describes Trumptopia. We've got crazy radical Christians who believe that Jesus would be down with mowing everybody over and letting God decide who the good guys or the bad guys are, and thus all Christians are supposed to stockpile guns. And, atheism, some of whom are really guns pro and some of whom are very pacifist. And it's a clusterfuck. But again, I digress. Continuing with Alan Watts's words, because the first of these alternatives is ultimately impossible, like chewing off one's own teeth, the second becomes inevitable, where such palliatives as the confessional are no longer effective, where such palliatives or such aid or such help as the confessional or the process of confessing one's sins are no longer effective, as is the nature of revolutions. The revolution against God gives place to the worst tyranny of the absolute state. Worse because it cannot even forgive, and because it recognizes nothing outside the powers of its jurisdiction. For while the latter was theoretically true of God, his earthly representative, the church, was always prepared to admit that though the law of God were immutable, no one could presume to name the limits of his mercy. When the throne of the absolute is left vacant, the relative usurps it and commits the real idolatry, the real indignity against God, the absolutizing of a concept, a conventional abstraction. And this, my friends, has come full circle on itself as a process, and we've absolutized the very notion of God. Our religions are flat cartoon, objectified, abusive, toxic, self-hurting, self-traumatized versions of what was once a true spiritual congress with us and the divine. We don't really commune with God anymore. We just politically pontificate about communing with God and then blame each other and castigate each other and marginalize each other and hate each other in the name of God. Taoism, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Oh, no, I'm not. This is important. Of course, he continues, of course, the very word absolute suggests to us something abstract and conceptual, such as, quote, pure being. Our very idea of, quote, spirit, as opposed to, quote, matter, seems to have more kinship with the abstract than the concrete. But Taoism, as with other ways of liberation, But with Taoism, as with other ways of liberation, the absolute must never be confused with the abstract. On the other hand, if we say that the Tao, as the ultimate reality is called, is the concrete rather than the abstract, this may lead to still other confusions. For we are accustomed to associate the concrete with the material, the physiological and the biological and the natural as distinct from the supernatural. But from the Taoist and the Buddhist standpoint, these are still terms of conventional and abstract spheres of knowledge. Thus, to begin to understand what Taoism is about, we must at least be prepared to admit the possibility of some view of the world other than the conventional, some knowledge other than the contents of our surface consciousness, which can apprehend reality only in the form of one abstraction or thought, the Chinese Nian, at a time. To put that in different words, if we are to understand enlightenment, we must acknowledge that there is something other than words, something other than ideas, something other than the laws we kowtow to, something other than the symbol for that which we call God, something other than these political parties and ideological memberships and these secret societies and these words that we are all clinging to. There is no real difficulty in this, for we will already admit that we, quote, know how to move our hands, how to make a decision, how to breathe, even though we can hardly begin to explain how we do it in words. We know how to do it because we just do it. Taoism is an extension of this kind of knowledge. And dare I say, or build upon his general premise, enlightenment itself is not an extension, but the very core of that kind of knowledge or phenomena or action. And that understanding this extension, as he puts it, which gives us a very different view of ourselves from that to which we are conventionally accustomed, and a view which liberates the human mind from its constricting identification with the abstract ego. I think you see my point. Thank you for tuning in, my friends. Oh, by the way, if you don't see my point, by all means, submit your questions. You can submit audio recorded questions on anchor.fm. Just make an account there, find me, Mr. Zeppo, follow me, and then submit your recorded question using the app. If you're voice shy, by all means, submit an email with your questions, thoughts, comments, and any recommendations of other books you think are worthy to adding to this series of unauthorized and explicit readings. I have been your host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Thank you so kindly for tuning in. If you like it, please share and please, let others know. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart, my friends.